of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you and welcome to the Attleboro School Committee meeting of Monday, December 6th, 2021. This is your notice that this meeting is being electronically recorded. We're going to start tonight with our business agenda, and to kick us off will be our Student Advisory Council reps with our Around Attleboro Public Schools update.
Good evening. This week's All Around Attleboro segment contains important information regarding the start of December.
For our SIC shoutouts this week, we're congratulating the AHS cheerleading team for placing fourth in the States and qualifying for the national competition. Philip Hannafin and Abigail Pliska have been accepted in the Southeastern Massachusetts Music Association Senior District Festival. Philip has also earned the opportunity to audition for the All State Fall Festival. Joseph Kyan will be representing Attleboro in the composition clinic portion of senior districts. AHS's Skills USA team brought home awards for the competition aspect of the Skills USA Fall Leadership Conference. Congratulations to Kaylee Martinez, Samantha Fergalt, Nicole Needham for receiving leadership awards, Maya Alho for receiving the MVP Participation Award, and Jeffrey Hooden for receiving 2 third-place medals for the best design and content for technical skills.
Congratulations.
Yeah, nice job.
This year's holiday break will be happening from December 24th until the 31st. There will be no school on January 1st and classes will resume on January 3rd.
For our elementary schools, Studley PTO's Candy Cane Lane is running on December 10th at 6:30 p.m. Friends and families are encouraged to decorate their cars, wear their favorite ugly sweaters, and drive through a winter and holiday scene. Thatcher is having an Uno's dough raiser on December 13th. Bring your friends and family to Uno's, and a portion of the meal sales will go back to Thatcher. Hill Roberts PTO meeting will be on December 14th at 6:30 p.m. Hyman Fine is hosting the EL PAC meeting on December 15th at 6:30 p.m. as well, in the library. Willits PTO meeting is on December 16th at 6 p.m., and this meeting will be virtual. For the middle schools, middle school parent-teacher conferences are running on December 8th from 12:30 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. and 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. and on December 9th from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. This is the time for parents or guardians to make an appointment with their student's teacher to ask questions or voice concerns. Brennan, Coelho, and Wonsetta are having Say Something assemblies for grades 6, 7, 8 through Sandy Hook Promise. Coelho's Christmas is for Kids drive ends on December 8th, and don't forget to donate. Finally, for the middle schools, Wamsutta Savers clothing drive ends on December 15th.
For the high school, trimester 2 begins today. The student forum, where we will be discussing branding and traditions, will be happening on December 9th at 7 p.m. in the B2 cafeteria. This is in conjunction with Student Council and the Marketing CTE. Varsity Jacket Night is happening in the Bray Auditorium on December 13th. And lastly, the Winter Concert will be performed on December 16th at 7 p.m. in the Bray Auditorium. For community engagement, the Blue Pride Ambassadors Club is hosting their online Palooza through December 11th to benefit the Varsity Booster Club, the music department, and the hockey program. Follow the BPAC on Facebook or see Mr. Rooney's Blue Mail for more detail. In addition, yearbooks are available for pre-order. If you'd like to put an ad in for your student, you may do so here. This concludes our segment of All Around Attleboro. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both very much. All right, next on our business agenda, we have our Superintendents Report. Mr. Sawyer.
Thank you, Chairman Withers. I have a few updates for you before we get to tonight's business. On the COVID front, I'm sure you've noticed with the data that I've been sending that cases have been rising as the state warned us would be the case. In fact, to date, in the first 3 months of 2021, we've had almost 3 times as many positive COVID cases among students as we did in 2020. So our perception that it's been a heavy load is borne out by the details. Now, I would like to point out that we didn't have routine testing at this time of year last year, so that's certainly a part of why we're seeing an increase. We also had a late start last year, so that's, it's not exactly apples to apples in terms of the number of weeks we're talking about. And I would point out that we weren't yet seeing a lot of cases among young students at this time last year. Most cases at that time were really among adults and older students. And it's only until we saw significant numbers of vaccinations that we really started to see an increase in the number of cases among young children. So those differences, I do think, help to explain the difference. But I think it's important to understand that we are facing a pretty significant increase over what we were used to. Furthermore, when you look at close contacts, in 2020, the entire school year last year, we had just under 1,900 close contacts that we worked through as a district. We will surpass that number this week for this school year. So obviously, part of why we're seeing so many close contacts, because, as I just said, the number of cases is up. More cases means more students are close contacts. But obviously, the other factor, which is, I think, an even larger one here, is that we've removed distancing that we had last year. And so kids are closer together because we have everybody back in the classrooms, we're very happy to have that. But the necessary consequence is that in the classroom and at lunch, which is another thing that we're doing differently this year, kids are closer than they were, and so that means more kids are being affected when we have close contacts. Now, the good news on that is that over 80% of the students affected in these close contacts are getting to stay in school this year through test and stay, whereas last year, they were all quarantined. So while the number is significantly higher for all the reasons that I just described, a significant portion of those students are getting to stay in school. And that's due to our testing program. The other data that I wanted to review was that we have had what we're at this point calling 9 incidents of possible in-school transmission. As I said, we still have some that we're investigating that will show up in Wednesday's report, depending on how those turn out. Now, that number 9 reflects some complications. It's a little bit harder than it used to be to call an incident of in-school transmission. One, we have overlapping exposure. Sometimes students are in school together, and then they also do after-school activities together. And so, which was the source of the transmission, we're not sure. But under the way we did things previously, if you had 2 kids who were within distance within a classroom, then you assumed that the transmission happened there. But as we investigate these things, we find that sometimes it's not that clear-cut as to whether it was really there or someplace else. Also, the arrow of causation isn't always clear to us. So I test positive, you're a close contact, 2 days later you test positive, and so we assume that I gave it to you. But sometimes when we start to do the contact tracing, it becomes confusing because we find out that you actually had someone at home who had tested positive, and so now it's possible that actually it went in the other direction, or that they're unrelated, that we just happen to be 2 people who were exposed in 2 different places who happen to sit next to each other. But again, we'll call that in-school transmission because we happen to sit together, so it may have happened. And that's the real thing is that there's no knowledge about causation, right? Like we don't really know when someone got it from someone else. Even when 2 people who sit together that have no other transmission, exposure to transmission that we know about, it could be that simply we picked it up someplace else in life, and then we just don't know about it. So for all these reasons, the state has taken a very different approach than we were used to. They're no longer giving up. I mean, last year, if you had 2 people in a room who were near each other, within distance, they called that in-school transmission, and they gave us a cluster number. They're not giving us cluster numbers anymore because they're saying that where the kinds of possible transmission that we're seeing in the district is not a concern to them because it's only affecting 1 or 2 people, and it's been limited to that. So they're not even giving us a cluster number anymore. It's not that they're not giving out cluster numbers, but they're not reserving that for where they have cases where 4, 5, 7, 12 people are all connected to a single case. And there are situations in Massachusetts where that's happening. We've all read the paper and seen that in some places they've had to shut down classes and schools. We haven't had that because all of our testing efforts and all of the contact tracing we've been doing have limited the possible spread to at most 1 or 2 people in the few cases where it may have happened and we're not even sure. So The numbers are much higher than we were experiencing last year, but the situation is a little bit more complicated, and I think that has to be factored into how we look at all of this. What I want the committee to know, and anyone watching at home to know, is that all of this increased load is a tremendous burden on our schools. The administration and the nurses in particular are under great strain to go through every day and deal with the implications of both the routine testing that we're doing in the building, the test and stay that falls from that, and also to deal with the implications of people who are testing positive or being identified as close contacts through their daily lives as well. So as these cases go up, as we get into this, into the winter season, and we're seeing the surge in cases, things are pretty tough in terms of us keeping our focus on learning. And I will say that our staff is really doing a fantastic job, because as much as all this is going on in the background, when you're in classrooms, when you're out in the district, you don't really see the impact in the classroom. Our classrooms are full of kids, not at distance, but engaged in meaningful learning, and that's possible because of all this hard work that's being done by dedicated staff to get through all of this and keep kids in school as much as possible. I think another important piece of information that I should share is that because we're seeing the surge and because it's becoming overwhelming for our staff to be able to handle it, we are hiring some temporary nursing staff to help get us through this. They need the support. They're overwhelmed. And again, this is what allows us to keep kids in school and allows classrooms to keep focused on learning, and not letting all of this be a distraction in the learning environment, as much as from an administrative and operational perspective, it's a total distraction. It's really, it's quite a challenge, and I wanted to express my appreciation to all of our employees who are helping to make it happen, but also I wanted to make you aware that it's been quite a challenge.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Hill.
Just on that, is it possible, do you think, to quantify in terms of the administration time related to these tracing and all of that? And it's good. My point in asking this is, first of all, just to acknowledge that it takes up a lot of time, but just try to get a sense of how much. But then, secondly, in terms of staffing and almost like a COVID czar or something like that on the administrative level.
So the administrators will tell you that this is a significant portion of every day. And it also is work on the weekends as well, because we find out about positive cases on Saturdays and Sundays, and so they're doing the contact tracing and calling families and all that. It's a 7-day-a-week job now, and in all of our schools, I would say the majority of most school days, that's how we're spending our time as an administration. What was your second question?
Just, I know you said you got nursing support.
Yeah.
Is there a sense to on the administrative side, almost like a COVID czar or something like that? Is it possible to add some support in that regard too?
So I think the nursing support helps both sides of that.
Okay.
And we also, part of the temporary staffing that we're adding is also some clerical support, I think, which gets to what you're talking about as well.
Got it.
But yeah, it's
Yeah, it seems like it.
While we're dealing with these increasing cases, I mean, we definitely had to get some help involved. And to be clear, we're using federal dollars that are exactly for this purpose to fund those positions. And they are temporary positions. We're posting them as such. And when the need goes away, so will the work. But in the short term, we're struggling, and the help we need to go out and get the help to get us through this.
Mr. Geddes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Related to the external close contacts that we're seeing, what percentage would you say are folks that are, for lack of a better phrase, self-reporting versus what you're hearing from the health department because of that, like you said, cross-exposure where?
Yeah, so almost entirely self-reporting.
Okay.
The state has stopped contact tracing. So, we're pretty much on our own, and I think anecdotally we're hearing that people are being told when they test positive that it's their responsibility to identify their close contacts. And then it's the honor system from there, which we're learning when, we have a couple different people, some people are doing the right thing, and then we find out that other people who are also informed just who aren't listening, no, they're not telling anybody until we find out, and it's been quite a ride, to be honest with you.
So it's likely, if at least not feasible, that a lot of close contacts are still coming to school without being reported or included.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be cynical, but there is reason to believe that there's at least some of that going on.
Okay. Thank you.
So my final comment on all of this is, as negative as all of that sounds, I think it's really important that we understand and embrace that on some level this is the new normal. As I mentioned in my update to you on Friday, we really need to adjust our thinking out of worrying about the pandemic and towards understanding this as an endemic, right? I don't think there's any reason to believe that in the near future COVID's going to go away, and so we have to start to learn how to deal with that. The fact that we're going to continue to see spread is something that I think last year was a condition that we were trying very, very hard to do our part to not be a part of. But now that everyone over the age of 5 has access to a vaccine, where I think we're moving to a stage in which we have to say that our focus is more on trying to shore up what we're doing as a school district for learning and moving on from having the balance be too much towards preventing spread, because at this point there's only so much we can do. And my final point about that is that as much as we've seen an increase in the schools and possible spread within the schools, schools still remain a much safer place, right? Of the cases that we know about in this school year, less than 5% of them are from the schools, right? And so kids spend way more than 5% of their time, in school, and yet the majority of the cases we're seeing are from contact out of school. And that's because school still remains, relative to other settings, one of the safest places you can be. And I think there are lots of people in this community who could say anecdotally that they took this very, very seriously. They did everything they were asked to do, and they still ended up with a COVID case in their family, right? That has happened to, I can't tell you how many people who, weren't, didn't take it frivolously, right? Like they took it very seriously, and they still dealt with a positive case. And that's because, it's a complicated situation, but school still remains. What we're doing and the amount of spread we're seeing in the school, I still feel like demonstrates that that's a safe place, and that's why I think it's very important that we're honest about the situation, but we need to learn to start to take this in stride and move our focus off of this and just accept that this is the way things are going to be moving forward, and that whatever we can do to help kids get back to a sense of normalcy is really what our focus should be. And as soon as the state says that it's safe to take steps in that direction, we should absolutely do so.
One question I had in relation to that and your email update on Friday is if there's been any discussion at the state level or at any of the professional groups you're in as to what that's going to look like as far as transitioning to an acceptance of an endemic phase and focusing on learning, realizing that we're obviously not there yet. But I don't know. That seems like something that the planning would start before.
So that's my second update, unless there's anything more about that
I didn't
one.
I didn't
Great
know what
transition.
planned.
Yeah, no. Well, I try to set it up so one thing leads to the next, right? So the DESE mask requirement, as you know, has been extended to the 15th. I think there's plenty of reason to wonder if they won't extend it again, but we'll find out, I'm sure, on January 10th. But as I shared with the committee before the Thanksgiving break, the Boston Globe ran an editorial on the 22nd, and they described a preliminary proposal that had been put together by the state doctors that has been sent to DESE. That proposal is, supposedly is sensitive to the differences in ages among the levels, with a bias towards making it easier for younger students to be unmasked than older students. So differing rules for differing ages, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, is what was described. Other factors to be considered in this proposal was school vaccination rates, community vaccination rates, and viral conditions within a community. So, as I told you then, and is still the case, DESE has yet to acknowledge to superintendents that they have received such a proposal and have made no comment on what the timeline for consideration is or what we should expect. So that remains a mystery. So, you know, I will keep the committee informed if they extend the requirement or give us any indication of what we can expect for when that extension ends. Because as we talked about extensively, you know, what's more likely than just ending it is replacing it with this other system. I have to, you know, I'll editorialize here. If, in fact, DESE embraces the system that was described in that Globe article, that will be a major change from my perspective, in that that's a really nuanced set of guidelines to consider the age of the kids and all those other factors and have different outcomes for different people. That hasn't been the approach, as you well know, right, up until this point. There's been a little bit of, you know, differentiation, but to have something that complicated hasn't really been how things have gone. So I'm not optimistic that that's exactly how it's going to play out. But we wait, and you know, certainly we'll let the committee and the community know as soon as we know what to expect from them.
Mr. Larson?
I just want to make sure I have everybody in the right order here, but hasn't DESE pretty much washed their hands of in-school requirements, and they've basically given sole jurisdiction to that to the Commissioner of Education? I mean, I was under the impression he was the one.
Yeah. So, but I mean, DESE is his. I mean, he's the head of DESE. So I'm using DESE euphemistically.
Okay. I had the impression that he was basically running the show on his own.
The State Board of Education gave him
carte blanche.
The power.
Okay.
But, like, you know, when we get things, it's from DESE, but it's, you know, it's all coordinated. It's all part of one policy that's he gets to decide on.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. So if there are no other questions about our favorite topic.
No, I mean, just that, I'll just say, you know, we still have a meeting on the 10th, and I kept that meeting on the schedule with the expectation that we'll, you know, have to discuss potential changes coming from the state at that time, maybe. But, you know, we said at the last meeting that we would meet again and talk about it before any changes were made on the 15th, so we do meet, well, the new committee will meet on January 10th. At which time we can take that back up. Yeah, Mr. Storrs.
Yeah, I just want to. I think the federal mandate regarding masks on airplanes and trains and things like that was just extended from January to March. So I would be floored if we don't see a similar thing coming.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a good reason to assume that, but I will say that in a couple different settings, the commissioner has said that he thinks that the Massachusetts Department of Health has had a better approach than CDC, and we have differed with the CDC on a couple occasions. So, and to be fair, the CDC is trying to set a national policy, and Massachusetts only has to do what's good for Massachusetts. And so sometimes the conditions here differ from the national conditions. So perhaps it'll be the same, but there's a chance that he might, not he, that the state doctors will go in a slightly different direction.
Okay.
All right, so the final thing I wanted to talk about tonight is to go back a little bit in time. As I'm sure everyone's aware, the gubernatorial race in Virginia last month was certainly a topic of interest to many people. And I personally took interest in the analysis of the outcome because it really centered on how education and concern for education was, by the opinion of many, to be a decisive factor in what some saw as a surprising outcome in that state governor's race. I'd like to first point out, before I talk about how I think that this is relevant to us, that, you know, there's danger in applying national stories to us here locally, right? Like, national stories don't always map well onto the local landscape. And it reminds me not to get too far off track, but several years ago, there was a national movement to adopt PARC as a national standard in testing, and there was great outcry at that effort, and there was a lot of national pushback on PARC, and it eventually failed. And if we were to really get off subject, I could give you a reason why I'm not sure that was a bad thing for us. But the irony is that when the national debate over this became anti-PARC, there was a pretty strong contingent here in Attleboro who became anti-PARC as well. And the thing that was surprising to me about that was that I felt like there was a lack of appreciation for the fact that didn't make a ton of sense here in Massachusetts, because what PARC was Massachusetts' attempt to foist the Massachusetts standards onto the country as a whole so that the testing would be cheaper because the scale of it would be national and not just for Massachusetts. So like MCAS is really, really expensive. And so if you can convince the entire country to do this test by calling it PARC, then you can, really make it cheaper to do testing in Massachusetts. But, for that to work, you got to convince the rest of the country to teach the same standards. And so there was a little bit of a compromise, but largely PARC was an attempt to make the Massachusetts standards a national standard. And so other places didn't like the idea of, having to adopt the Massachusetts standards, and they pushed back. But to hear that national argument then here in Attleboro being against PARC, when in fact we were already operating under the standards that people were objecting to, saying weren't good enough because we have Massachusetts standards, right? So I just, it reminded me of that because, again, sometimes these national stories don't translate well locally. And in this case, part of the story I don't think does, because as I read it, and I'm no expert on Virginia politics, but it seems to me that the issue there was parents did not like being told that they did not have say over their schools. And that makes perfect sense. Of course that's the case. But again, I don't think that translates well into Massachusetts, because Virginia, like most of the country, has county-based schools, right? So that would be like if, people in Attleboro belonged to a school district that wasn't the Attleboro school district, was the Bristol County school district, right? And so feeling like you don't have control over your school because you're answering to a board of people who don't live in your community, right? This would be like if the Attleboro Public Schools was being run by some people in Acushnet, right? That kind of distance, it was at the heart of, I think, why people were concerned about being told that, they weren't, they didn't have say in their schools. Because here in Massachusetts, with, our school district, which is not the most efficient, and one of the reasons why most of the country does county schools is because that's, in terms of the scale of it, it's more efficient. But it lacks in local authority, which is the strength of our Massachusetts system, right? And so the concerns that you hear from the Virginia analysis, I don't think really apply to us quite as neatly, because the Attleboro Public Schools are governed, as you people know better than anybody, by the people of Attleboro, right? And so Attleboro's residents have real say, because their neighbors are the people who are overseeing the schools, not some people from Fairhaven that they've never met. So in that way, I don't think it's a particularly useful comparison. And I would add that, from where I sit, the recent tensions, that have existed over some school decisions in the last couple of years, don't come from that kind of lack of control that I think was at the heart of the situation in Virginia, right? What it really comes down to is that Attleboro, unlike a lot of places, isn't, in today's red and blue America, Attleboro is purple. I think definitively purple. And so it's not that there isn't, local authority in our schools. I think quite the opposite. I think this board represents the wide range of political positions that exist in this community. And so the disagreements that we have really just reflect the fact that as a community, we have a wide range of opinions on some of the issues that face us as a community. And I think it's natural and healthy that we have that, have that kind of representation, that conversation, and those kinds of disagreements, because it's reflective of who we are as a community, and again, I think that people should appreciate the fact that there is real accountability here locally to a school board that knows this community and is part of this community. So, from my perspective, as a school district or as the administration in the school district, it's our duty to respectfully hear that full range of the spectrum, to listen and to try our best to be sensitive to the community as a whole, and then keep our focus on our mission, which always is to serve all students. Right? We gotta serve them all, regardless of where their families might fall on some sort of spectrum. We're here to serve all families. And then, and this is the key point, we want to stick to our vision, which is to be the center of a community united around education. And this is where I'd like to conclude my point as we move into the budget conversation, right? The Virginia story, I think, reminds us that people do care about education. And, we sit here tonight, well, there's no shadows at night, but, we exist in the shadow of a new building, which, proved that Attleboro cares about education in that definitive moment. And, we as a community do care about education. And as part of that care, I think that our concerns around how education is funded in Massachusetts should be the thing that unites us. We do have our disagreements as a community about what's best in the schools and how we should run things, right? But I think we can all come together in saying that the conditions that we face are unfair to the children of Attleboro. And I don't think I've done a good enough job in this particular role in making the case that the system itself is the problem and that it's delivering outcomes that are not fair to our children. And I think we should, as a community, be more upset about that, because the truth of the matter is the problem is getting worse, not better, despite everyone's best efforts. We this year calculated based off of the most recent data, which is a year or two old. Right now, the gap between what the school budget is and what it would be if our funding was average. Again, not high, not in the top half, simply average funding in the Commonwealth, right? We are $20 million away from average. I can't say enough how devastating that is to our ability to deliver a comparable education that other communities are able to do, that we are short $20 million of average. I've talked multiple times about how ultimately this is about the fact that Attleboro is a tweener, right? The system that we operate in, counts on wealthy communities to pick up the difference themselves, and that it funds poor communities at a very different rate, which helps them to deal with the problems of poverty, which are real and pervasive and conditions I wouldn't want to trade my position on, right? But the fact of the matter is a place like Attleboro, which I don't think is all that common. We're not unique, but most communities in Attleboro fall neatly into either end of the spectrum. We're one of those rare places where we are not poor enough to get extra, and we are not wealthy enough to just pick up the difference. Because at $20 million, right, I mean, roughly speaking, right, that would be something akin to almost a 50% increase on the city's part of what they pay for their schools, right? I mean, that's an enormous number, well beyond the city's capacity to meet that. We've talked a lot about, every year we talk about budget, and it's a lot of concern about the fact that we need this much and the city can only give us this much, and we haggle about the differences there. But those differences are minuscule compared to the real problem, which is that the actual deficit is this gigantic number that overshadows the whole operation. Ms. Regan and Mr. Furtado are going to give you a budget presentation. They're going to walk you through, what the picture is for next year, and we'll go through the process like we do every year, but it's very important to understand that there's nothing the city can do. I mean, in any given budget year, obviously there's choices to be made, and you could always give a little bit more than you give. So, the idea that like not another penny could be given to the schools, I mean, that's obviously not true, but it is true that no amount of money that the city could conceivably give would change the outcomes for us, right? In a meaningful way. It's marginal, because the amount that we're off by is the transformative amount. Even if we closed the gap by half and only were $10 million off, right? A $10 million increase of our budget, which is well beyond what the city can provide us by a magnitude of more than 10, that would completely change the way we can do business in Attleboro. And so, while we get lost in the numbers that we're about to talk about, I just really think that it's important to understand that, at the deepest level, the state has created conditions in which our children, right, here in Attleboro, are getting less, significantly less, and there's little that we can do to change that for ourselves, and that's a pretty serious inequity that we as a community should be able to unite around and express our collective outrage. So with that,
Sorry, Mr. Sorry, I just
Yes.
want to clarify it a little bit. Just to kind of take that last point home, you're not advocating that the city just dropped $20 million on our budget for next year by any means. But-
more than that, I'm saying that I agree with the city's claims that they can't.
Right, and so
I know that to be true.
So I guess, but to wrap up a little bit of what you said, a year or two ago, we talked about how there's a $10 million gap between what we get and what we really need to properly serve the community. And that was a couple of years ago, so now we're probably closer to a $12 million gap. But if we were just getting the average funding in the Commonwealth, we'd be getting $20 million more. So not only would we be properly serving the community at a minimum level for what should be expected from a school district,
Yep.
but we'd actually be exceeding that if we were average. So what we need would still be below average for the Commonwealth.
Yeah, no, our need assessment, which we're in the process of updating, and we'll present that to you when we have that completed. Yeah, it's well less than that 20 million, right? And that's because as a district, we're pretty good at doing a lot with less.
Right.
It's our talent, and it goes without saying, but I should say it again anyways. The employees here, right? Your staff, your educators, and the support staff. That's how that gets done. They do a tremendous job, and many of them go well beyond what anyone could ever expect of them, and they make up the difference. So because of that's our way of getting things done. When we look at like being realistic about what do we need to just do what we're being asked to do, we come up with a number that's well below the 20 million that would just make us average. So I think it's a very important point, and I appreciate you reminding everybody that that number, which some people scoff at as a wish list, I mean that's significantly less than, again, what would make us average, and represents a portion of what we really should have.
Thank you.
Mrs. George.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, when we get to this point every year, one of the things that I think is very important to put out there is the percentage of the overall budget that is not, for lack of a better term, not within our control. What I mean by that is how much of our budget is flexible spending.
Yeah, discretionary.
Discretionary spending as compared to the salaries, the benefits, the facilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, because people hear our total budget and they go, oh my gosh, how can't you not find money in there? And then when you have this conversation with people out on the street and you explain to them the percentage of what we actually have a little discretionary control over, they're amazed. And before we get into it, I'm not sure if you're going to touch on it, probably not. So could we actually have that percentage of what is actually considered discretionary as compared to the overall?
I mean, the number we use is under 2%, but I'll ask Mr. Furtado if he has a better number than that.
Yeah, it's under 2%, and it's under $2 million.
Thank you.
It's out of the 85.
Right, 85 to $90 million budget, we're talking a couple of percent. I think that's important to put out there. Thank you.
All right, at this time, I'll turn it over to Ms. Regan to begin our presentation.
Thank you, Superintendent Sawyer. So tonight, like most years, we'll review what we believe to be our budget and our priorities based upon our new COVID reality and also maintaining our progress moving forward. So what are we striving to accomplish? The goals this evening are to share information on how COVID continues to impact the system and our current budget, to take a look at the projections for next year, to review what our staff that was surveyed believed to be our priorities as well as the administration, and to share how that all fits together in our current budget. So Mr. Furtado will start this by sharing the impact of COVID on what we have right now in our current budget.
Good evening. I'm going to try to go through this quickly. If there are any questions, please stop me. It's not like past budget years. There's a lot of kind of lefts and rights that aren't normal. So if I'm going too fast, just let me know. If you recall, our current budget is 81 million change and was driven by foundation enrollment that was suppressed significantly by the COVID pandemic. So we were going into this year underfunded from a level service budget by almost $2 million. From my seat, it's kind of a scary proposition. The city, the state allowed some COVID grant money to be used to fill that gap. They knew the gap existed. They didn't propose any way for state funding to take care of it. They left about $300 million in the bank that should have gone to school districts or was planned to go to school districts before it became apparent that enrollments were down. And then they made the COVID grants from the federal government available to cover that gap. The city then took that number, that gap number, and funded it through the surplus funds at the end of this last fiscal year. So we didn't use COVID grants for this purpose. We used unexpended funds from the city for this purpose. Yeah.
And I apologize if you were going to get into this next, but does that mean that we're starting from a hole?
Yeah.
Given that we had to use one-time funds to cover that?
To operate, that's correct, yes. And again, it's about $1.2 million, $1.3 million. So what COVID did, suppressed our enrollment, limited our state funding through the foundation formula. That was compensated with carryover funds or unexpended funds from FY21 from the city, but they're not there for the 23 budget. That is correct. Where are we now? So our net school spending budget is just under $79 million, which was a 2% increase from FY21. That includes that gap money. Support for FY22. We're primarily running this year on ESSER 2 funds. We fully expended ESSER 1 funding. We took great advantage of the city's COVID grants. So FY22 is about $2.8 million in ESSER 2 funds and includes things like administrative support, the virtual academy, paraprofessional support in kindergarten, cleaning and disinfecting efforts after hours, and a continuing assessment of the building's air quality. COVID-related costs that are not grant eligible that we've had to kind of run around and find ways to solve is abacus, a significant deficit in 21, still running a deficit in 22. Transportation, you've all read about evictions and homelessness through the pandemic. That is really starting to hit us pretty significantly in terms of McKinney-Vento transportation. We usually have a big bump at the beginning of the year. We have a big bump right after the holidays. And then after those things, it calms down. The beginning of the year bump this year did not calm down. We're still getting hit every single day. The circumstances are quite extraordinary. We've got a family of 4 children in Attleboro who are going to 4 different schools in Boston that we're transporting on separate vans every morning. Things like that.
Mr. Furtado.
Yeah.
McKinney-Vento is not necessarily special education.
Correct.
So that cannot be covered by the special education stabilization fund, or is
It cannot.
it
Correct.
cannot? Okay.
Yeah. Air exchange, everybody's, rightfully so, we kind of landed on that earlier than the kind of trend. And thankfully, part of it's luck. It's always good to be lucky. But air exchange has been our focus from the very beginning. So we've increased our costs. We've added a filter replacement from 2 to 3 in the year. Now that we're blowing fresh air 24/7, utility costs, and you can understand all that. So we're covering all that. Those are not kind of COVID related. For next year, so between the coverage and the COVID grants and the city spending unexpended funds from the end of 21, we're about $2.8 million in unbudgeted support for 22. 1.4 in ESSER funds and 1.2 in city funds. And we've got, as always, we've got a bunch of things in 23 that are coming that we're going to have to deal with. The new high school operating costs are going to go up significantly, especially electricity and custodial. We've got new CTE programs that we have to kind of front-end fund, and then as the students enroll, that'll come back, but we still have to pay for it next year. We have a need for new curriculum, and then a hope to expand the ACA toward middle school students as well as the current high school population.
Mr. Larson?
That's right. I was going to reserve this comment for my report later on, but the slide that's up there right now, I think, is very appropriate to go back to Superintendent Sawyer's comment about where we are, where we'd like to be, the dream to someday be average. We need to get beyond this number first.
Right.
Because Attleboro as a city is funding current operations off one-time grants and last year's money before we can even approach what the superintendent was just talking about. So the numbers that are up on the screen, we need to cover first, because someday in the not-so-distant future, they may or may not be there. And then we can move forward.
In addition to all of this, we're in contract years for our major vendors, facilities, transportation. Again, you're all reading about inflation. We've done a great job maintaining those kind of cost structures over the last, I want to say, 10 years. That's not going to hold in 23. I don't know where it's going to go. We're going to fight and, yell at each other and stuff and see what comes out. But it's going to be beyond our normal two points. I just have to make you aware of that too. So, in addition to the one-time funds, we're going to have some contractual costs that are going to get a little higher than normal, and we're starting up a new high school. The good news is that we have about $1 million in ESHA 2 that will be available for 23, and we've got a significant amount of ESHA 3 money that we intended and plan to use already for 23. So that coverage currently in ESHA 2 for this year, we certainly have the funding to deal with that next year and even into 24. But beyond that, as Mr. Lawson is pointing out, the bill will come due. I'm going to make some assumptions for things like health insurance. I do know that the trust fund has a pretty significant balance, and across multiple years, I think the city will again be able to say no meaningful increase in health insurance rates. We're at 120,000 per point, and they certainly haven't indicated to us what next year's health insurance will be, and then we certainly expect and are assuming that the mayor's $2.35 million commitment above net school spending is going to hold as well. So that all being said, running a very preliminary look at 23, assuming the new cost for the high school and some other things are kind of first blush at a level service budget. We're not doing anything new, anything exciting. Is sort of the mid 85 million range. So we're funded. The school funding that was in the city budget in August was 81 change. So we're looking for $4 million, roughly. That's really rough. We know some things. We know that our enrollment rebounded by around 100 students. So that's going to be $1.5 million-ish off of that hole. We also know that CTE, as you learned recently, has done just an amazing job enrolling even more students in the program. That's going to result in additional revenues for the district in 23, bringing that $4 million number down to maybe, maybe 2.5, maybe. In addition, the state is obligated to institute another phase in the Student Opportunity Act funding that, again, didn't quite go last year the way it was supposed to. So, they're wrestling with a bunch of stuff as well. They purposely underfunded the schools last year. All the schools are bouncing back, and now they've got some real numbers to digest and figure out what to do. So that it'll be just a fascinating budget year. Hopefully a good fascinating budget year, but a fascinating budget year nonetheless. So between SOA and adjustments to foundation funding, we'll see what can happen with that $2.5 million. And then beyond that, our usual, get to work and do what we can without causing too much harm. So, just again as a reminder, the governor will be releasing his budget in January. I've heard nothing about any adjustments, any impacts from new funding. Legislative process will go through April, May, and then the reconciled budget will come out May, June, and we'll kind of know where we are at that point. So I'll take any questions.
Mr. Geddes?
Thank you. You mentioned about a $250,000 increase transitioning to the new high school just based on electricity. I know there was also a consideration that the new high school would have far more updated systems, which would reduce repair and maintenance costs compared to what we're dealing with in the current building. So is that 250 solely an increase in electrical and anticipated electrical costs, or is that a net cost when considering those other maintenance?
No. The 250 is a reflection solely in kind of heat and electricity. So we expect our environmental systems to work at a much better rate, more efficient. We expect to see a significant reduction in the cooling and heating costs of the building. So that's going to be offset. Most new schools, when they open first or second year of operation, have a doubling of their electric bills. Our electric bill for the high school is something around $320,000 a year. So that's a kind of a net of all of that. We're going to need some additional custodial help in that building. We still haven't kind of determined how that's going to be structured, but there'll be some additional personnel there. Maintenance will go down, certainly, without a question. In addition, I don't want to jinx myself, but the train performance contract is theoretically going to be eligible to be signed next week. So all of that work will be going on as well. So our building maintenance costs us something around $300,000 a year. So there'll be a reduction there, especially with the train work added. But I haven't factored that in yet.
Okay, thank you.
One question I had regarding the city funding and you mentioned the mayor's commitment of about approximately 2.35 over net school spending, which is what we've been getting. Has there been any discussion about the marijuana money that's come into the city? Because I know that had been and it may just be that you guys might not know, but that was an issue that the mayor I know had raised before as another funding source for the schools.
Yes, but it's not permanent, it's temporary, so it's been discussed to fund some school-related benefits that are one-time expenses.
Okay. Mrs. Storrs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You'd indicated $250,000 for middle school ACA. So are we actually looking to do that next school year?
Yeah, so nothing particularly requiring that to happen for next year, except that we designed the building to have it.
Okay.
So, most of our ACA experience is at night and doesn't require an additional space because, the building isn't being used at night for the most part, at least not the classrooms. But we have a dedicated space to the ACA because the plan from many years ago was that the ACA would include a 7th and 8th grade component and that those kids would be in the building during the school day because at that age they're in there. So those classrooms were built for that program, and we've been, discussing, the plan to have a middle school program, which is why it was, mentioned as a tentative. It'll be a real waste to have those classrooms empty all day long, waiting for us to fund those positions.
And just to verify, those classrooms would be in the middle school buildings or in the new?
No, they're in the new. It's part of the wing in a specific wing in the new building.
So the $250,000 for next year would be used for what purpose? Staffing. But we wouldn't actually start the classes yet? Is that what you're indicating? Or in next school year, we would start the classes?
If we have the staff, we'll have a middle school program.
All right. Thank you. Confusing.
Okay.
So what are our priorities? Our teachers continue to scaffold new learning for students every single day based upon our current standard in a COVID environment. And I have to be honest, this is just one of the many, many areas that they target on a daily basis, along with our students' behavioral needs and social emotional well-being. And so, as Superintendent Sawyer said earlier today, our teachers and staff continue to deliver high-quality experiences with just less than average resources. And so, you know, their ability to continue to address learning gaps is because of their ability to currently do that. Pre-pandemic, we also focused on lowering class sizes, and we've made gains in this area, but this is obviously still an area that we need to continue to focus on. Increasing support for inclusive practices is also a pre-pandemic goal, and there is an increased need for our special education students as well as our English language learners. And then also, as Mr. Furtado mentioned earlier tonight, and Superintendent Sawyer also discussed, absorbing costs in the new high school, but that also includes our new CTE programs, preparing for the house model, as well as the new schedule. And thinking about, you know, looking at our ESSER funds, we need to continue to start to think of ways that we can absorb those funds into the operating budget. The K-2 paraprofessionals that were hired this year to support student learning are directly targeting students every single day in focused instruction. And we've seen them create, you know, some gains or to produce gains for students that are actually working with those teachers and that staff. For social emotional learning, we hired a director of social emotional learning. She's right now in the process of, you know, reviving some of the positive behavior supports and systems that were put in place before the pandemic, and she's taking stock of where we are right now and trying to put some of those structures back in place in each of the buildings. You know, she's also planning and preparing for the new welcome center at the high school and putting some communication systems in place as well. Special education and nursing supports still need to be an area that we focus on as well. And you heard Superintendent Sawyer talk about the increased need for nursing staff to support all of the daily action that needs to take place for students because of COVID. So, once again, our priority, as mentioned earlier, the teachers completed and staff completed a survey. The main priorities that were identified were additional staff, meaning classroom teachers, paraprofessionals, and adjustment counselors. Again, the transition to the high school will be here before we know it, and so we want to make sure that we are prepared for the house model, the schedule, and the CTE programs, as we've already mentioned. And then also, we've heard a student previously, Meredith Plitzka, she spoke very highly about the music program, and it's important to her education here at Attleboro High School and in the Attleboro Public Schools. And we saw some students as part of the shout out tonight that were being recognized for their accolades in music. And so I feel like in this moment it's also important for us to recognize that we need to start to focus on a middle school feeder program to support the growth and development of the music program for the Attleboro schools. So what does this all mean? Our two main priorities are staffing, and the second one is, you know, to really find ways that we can maintain all of the supports that we have enjoyed through the use of ESSER funds. So what are our next steps? So as Mr. Furtado mentioned earlier, governor's budget will be in January. The House proposal will be at sometime in the spring, and then the release of the reconciled budget will be sometime in May or June.
Thank you all very much. Look forward to further presentations and discussions on this as we work towards a fiscal year 2023 budget. So thank you. Who would have thought that I'd be happy to hear a budget discussion at a school committee meeting, but it's where we are, I guess. Anything else, Mr. Sawyer?
That concludes my report.
All right, thank you. We're going to table the minutes from our last meeting and take those up at our next meeting in January. So we'll move on to our consent agenda items. There's 6. Motion to accept a donation in the amount of $225.95 from Bliss Brothers to Attleboro High School Student Council. Motion to accept a donation in the amount of $50 from Target to the high school gifts donation line. Motion to accept a donation in the amount of $192.27 from Bliss Brothers to the class of 2023. Motion to accept a payment in the amount of $21 from Bay State Textiles to Hill Roberts. Motion to accept the contractual obligation amount of $43 from Planet Aid Inc. is broken down on the check receipt dated November 12, 2021. And motion to approve field trip proposal for 15 grade 9 through 12 cheerleaders to attend the National High School Cheerleading Championship in Orlando, Florida from March 17th to March 22nd, 2022.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Motion's passed. Next subcommittee meeting reports, we just have one, Mr. Larson.
Budget and Finance Subcommittee met on December 1st. Mr. Furtado took us through the annual financials. As of right now, the budget is performing to our satisfaction. We had an MSBA update as far as the new high school going. Again, currently it's on schedule and on budget. There was a concern, and I don't know if anything's changed. I'm going to take advantage of Mr. Furtado being here. We had a discussion about the utilities, possibly slowing us down a little bit, but
I didn't hear anything today, so.
I thought I saw a truck out front the other day.
Yes, they're here. They're definitely here. I don't know if they finished their work though.
Okay, so we are waiting for the utility companies to finish hooking up the new building to its own direct power, which would be nice considering it gets dark earlier and it's getting colder. So we had a discussion about the ongoing McKinney-Vento, the concerns, the funding that we're spending, and that it's not going to last forever. We had a long discussion about, as we spoke earlier, the way that we're funding FY22. We started looking at the prospects of FY23 and a really brief discussion about FY24, and we're just reviewing how much of the current budgets that we're actually spending on either ESSER funds or carryover that really just aren't sustainable in the long run. And at some point, the committee and we all felt that at some point this is really going to come back and be a real issue that we're going to have to address. And lastly, we thanked Mr. Hill for participating all year in the Budget and Finance Subcommittee, and it's been a pleasure to have him on the committee, and certainly we'll miss you.
Thank you very much.
And that concludes my comments.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Mr. DeBenchi?
I apologize. I just had a quick question. I wanted to wait for your budget report.
Sure.
So that 1.2 million from the city, from the surplus, is that essentially the monies that we had as an overage?
Yes.
At the end of the year? And I'm not imagining that we're going to be expecting that. I know it's early in the year, but I mean, we had things we weren't doing last year. We didn't have all the kids in school, so the expectation would be that we're probably going to go right up to the very end of the runway when it comes to landing on our budget.
Pretty normal year.
Okay, thank you.
And now you understand our conversation.
Oh, yes,
Went
yes,
on and on and
exactly.
on and on.
Yeah, I mean, that money was essentially our overage from last year's budget given back to us, and we're probably not going to have that. That was an anomaly.
Don't know yet.
So, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. That concludes subcommittee reports. Next, we have open forum. Is there anyone who would like to address the committee at open forum? I don't see anyone, so I'll go ahead and close open forum. Just new old business, just to echo what Mr. Larson said, this is the last regular meeting of this term, so unless something unexpected happens, we won't meet again as this committee, which means it's our last meeting with Mr. Hill, so I want to thank him for his service, and it's been a pleasure serving with you on this committee. You certainly bring a lot of expertise and knowledge in the area of education, so thank you for...
It was an honor to serve. Thank you so much.
Sorry, it was such an awkward term. Difficult 2 years.
Anyone else have any new business? I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.